So good morning, everybody. We are still waiting for our guests to enter this fourth of our Thursday creative talks. Just let us wait some minutes so that everybody has come in. Okay, I think we are almost there. 140 spectators assisting to this fourth edition of our Thursday creative talks. Now we go in even further. Somebody more coming in. Okay, I'll start with a short introduction to what where this webinar belongs to. First of all, you are aware that this webinar is recorded so that you can find it later on our the project's YouTube channel. This means that your presence will be somehow accounted for, but you signed that you are aware of that and agree to that. Welcome to this fourth edition of our series of creative talks initiated by the CREATE project. It is dedicated to maritime spatial planning in a changing climate. Just some words on the, wait a second, oops. On our agenda today, I will just briefly explain what the CREATE project is about. No, 2 words before. Normally, these creative talks are held in Italian and Croatian, as these are the 2 languages our project is addressing. But due to the special argument this time, we choose to have we choose to have it in English language and have translations to Italian and Croatian. So if you choose the globe and the bottom right side of the screen, you can choose either to listen to the English version, which is the main language on this webinar, or to listen to the translations provided by Maurizio and Daira into Italian and Croatian. Thanks to the 2 of them to facilitate our communication. And I think it will be a great experience in this way. I will briefly explain you what this cluster project is about. And then Emiliano Ramieri, my colleague, will take over and introduce this exchange of knowledge and experiences dedicated to maritime spatial planning. Introducing the speakers, Catarina, Frazao, Santos. He himself will present the Italian experience, and Vesna Marohnić Kuzmanović from Croatia will add with her experience from Croatia. At the end of these 3 short contributions, we will have a question and answer session. You can post your questions in the questions balloon on the left-hand side on the bottom of your Zoom screen. The Zoom project, the CREATE project is a cluster project which has been financed by the Interact project Italy, Croatia. We are working across these 2 countries, and we are clustering the experiences in a very short term. We were working for 1 year, and on the whole, from foregone Interact projects. So members of our projects are coming from different Interact Italy, Croatia experiences, which have all in some way addressed the issue of climate change adaptation in the Adriatic basin. We started in the 1st of June and we will finish on the 31st of June next year with the final conference, which will take place in mid-June in Venice. We are 8 partners, 4 from Italy and 4 from Croatia. Have a budget of almost 600,000 euros. I'm the project coordinator, by the way, from the CMCC, and our partners are the county of Split Dalmatia, the region of Abruzzo, EIHP, CNR, the Institute for Oceanography of Split, UAF University, Paprak. What we are doing is we are organizing these creative talks. You are assisting to now of the 4th of overall 8 appointments. We are working on an inventory of knowledge projects from the projects which are clustered in CREATE, but also beyond of that. We use this information and more for creating an adaptation handbook. We have addressed in particular the issue of governance of climate policies and climate adaptation in both national context. The workshop on the Croatian situation has already taken place in October last year, and the one on Italy will take place in March this year in Pescara. We just launched an adaptation award. I will come to that in a minute, and we are developing new project ideas for new Interreg projects to better address the gaps we are detecting. The Great Adriatic Adaptation Award has just been launched last week. We want to award successful implementation projects. So what has already been done to get a better awareness on what can be done and have good practice examples for those who need to go further with their adaptation work. And implementation initiatives which can be proposed for the awards are the whole range of adaptation options, that is from nature-based solutions, governance solutions, up to technological solutions. We have published an invitation on the 1st of February, so last week, and this invitation is open until the 10th of March at the end of the day, not only end of business. You can find more information on our project website, which is simply the program website of the Interreg CBC project Italy-Croatia, where you need to search for CREATE, and then you can find all information you need on the adaptation award. Further to all our social media channels, which I will present to you later. The thematic webinars which are still outstanding, which are still coming, is the next one on the 13th of April, synergies between mitigation and adaptation. On the 11th of May, how to communicate about climate change and the need of action and the need of adaptation action. And on the 15th of June, on governance. As I said, we have a multitude of social media channels. You can see the addresses here. In particular, on the YouTube channel, if you look for Create Climate Responses, you can find registrations of past webinars. And this one will be published as soon as some editing has been done, if needed. So this is what I wanted to tell you. Did I forget anything? I hope not. I give the word to Emiliano, who will introduce you to the argument of this webinar, and enjoy.
Thank you, Margaretha. Good morning, everybody, from myself as well. Very happy to be here and provide my contribution to this talk this morning. We, in the next 1 hour, less than 1 hour, will touch upon the interactions between maritime spatial planning and climate change, and more specifically climate change adaptation from a couple of perspectives. We'll talk a bit about how this can be strategically framed and contextualize. And we'll have an introductory presentation by Catarina Frazao Santos, and then we'll enter into two practical examples about how the two countries of the Interreg program, Italy and Croatia, are considering climate change into their national process of maritime spatial planning. Try to link also to the role that subnational governance level might have in this perspective. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Catarina for her talk. Catarina is a friend of me. She is a researcher, lecturer at the University of Lisbon, and her interests mainly focus on ocean sustainability, and of course, including sustainable ocean planning, and the linkages between the two topics we are addressing this year is very strict. Last but not least, she is the coordinator of a novel and I would say quite innovative project on this aspect, which will address, as far as I know, for one of the first time, the very interesting topic of maritime spatial planning in the Arctic, and the obvious connection with climate change are pretty clear to all of us. So, Catarina, thanks again for your presence here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I will just share my screen. Okay, I hope that everyone can see it. Oops. Thank you so much, Emiliano, for the kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here today to explore a bit the marine spatial planning and climate change nexus. So, without no further ado, climate change has been in the international agenda for over 3 decades now, but probably never as much as today. The most recent IPCC report focused on the ocean clearly acknowledged that we cannot protect the ocean without solving climate change, and we cannot solve climate change without protecting the ocean. So it's clearly interrelated. And we know that the ocean is getting warmer, it is getting more acidic, with less oxygen. We are losing ice, especially in polar regions. And as Emiliano said, we are starting a project that addresses marine spatial planning in polar regions, both the Arctic and Antarctica. And because of this, sea level is rising. And all of these changes are affecting marine ecosystems, their structure, the way they function. Some species are redistributing, moving towards the poles or to deeper layers in the ocean, in the case of marine species. Biomass is decreasing, of course, depending on region. And all of these will affect the way that humans use, benefit, and connect to the ocean. So marine ecosystems provide services on which human uses and activities depend, like aquaculture, fisheries, marine and coastal tourism, and even ocean conservation, because it is a use of the ocean space. But other uses that do not rely on marine ecosystems, like seabed mining or shipping or renewable energy production, will also be affected by climate-related changes in ocean conditions, like changes in wind patterns or more extreme events. So different uses will be differently affected by climate change, and this will change depending on region. Fisheries will not be affected the same in tropical areas or in the poles, for example. Because of what marine spatial planning does is to manage these interactions between uses and between uses in the environment, it will be affected by all of these upcoming changes. We will have potentially new conflicts between uses. We will have new environmental pressures, and we will also have new legal issues because a lot of the ocean activities require special permits to take place. So the problem here is that despite all of these interconnection and all these effects on marine spatial planning that we are expecting, climate change is often neglected as a factor in MSP. And why is this important? Well, first, because if we want our plans to keep viable, relevant, and useful in the long term, and the ocean is changing, MSP needs to integrate this information. And probably more importantly, because when developed with climate change considerations, MSP can support climate adaptation and even climate mitigation. So what can we do? We need to move towards climate smart MSP. And climate smart MSP, so marine spatial planning that takes into account climate information and that plans according to it, has been defined as one of the 6 priority areas by the European Commission and UNESCO in the new MSP roadmap that was launched just a couple of months ago. So how can we support and move towards the development and implementation of these climate smart marine spatial plans? There are 3 main pathways that can take us there. One of them is integrating knowledge on climate impacts. The second one has to do with supporting flexible and adaptive planning. And the third one, and the one that I would like you to have more attention, is supporting climate adaptation and also mitigation actions. And these 3 pathways, they are interconnected. They work together. In some cases, we can have the 3 of them. In other cases, we can just have 1 or 2, but the 3 of them will work towards this development of climate smart MSP. So getting to the first one, integrating knowledge on climate impacts, we can do it in several ways. One of them is by using modeling and mapping tools that assess changes not only in marine ecosystems, but also on dependent human activities. And many times we can use global projections to use and predict species ranges alterations or ecological boundaries. For example, this was a study conducted in the US that used 10,000 projections for marine animals around North America to understand the extent, the spatial area that needed to be added to ocean plants to make them climate resilient. But we can also use vulnerability and risk analysis, and here we will be focusing not on the changes, but the consequences of those changes. And we have examples in Maria with social ecological vulnerability of small-scale fisheries, or in the United States, again, with cumulative risk of human activities. But we can also use development of spatial use scenarios, imagine futures, envisioning processes to understand what is coming due to climate change. And there is this case in the Western Tropical Pacific where stakeholders work together with decision makers to create both catastrophic and optimistic climate-related scenarios to support marine spatial planning. So the second step, supporting flexible and adaptive planning, there are many ways to do this as well. The approach that has been discussed as having more potential is dynamic ocean management, which is an approach that uses near real-time data to establish management boundaries that are dynamic. And we have examples on this being applied to fisheries, conservation in the US and in Australia. And also this new idea of using mobile protected areas in the high seas. This was a paper published in Science in 2020. So it is something that is being debated. But we can also use the more traditional adaptive management and adaptive governance approaches that are conceptually embedded already in marine spatial planning, where we assess, we design, we implement, and then we adjust based on obtained results. Or we can use other approaches like anticipatory zoning, where we define areas beforehand to certain uses or to the exclusion of uses based on what is expected from climate change. And we have cases in the Arctic where commercial fishing was closed in advance using the status of protected areas. But then we get to this third pathway, the one about supporting climate adaptation actions and mitigation actions. And of course that I'm going through all of these pathways in a very brief way. We could spend an entire webinar just talking about one of them, but this will give you the broad idea about the interconnections between MSP and climate change. And so supporting climate adaptation and mitigation actions is really about two different things. One, about mitigation actions, so actions to reduce emissions that cause climate change. And two, adaptation actions, so actions that manage the consequences, the risks of climate change impacts. And adaptation is where I would like to keep a bit more of attention. So adaptation is the adjustment in ecological, social, economic systems in response to the actual or expected climate effects. So it refers to changes in processes, practices, and structures to moderate potential damages or to benefit from opportunities that come from climate change. And this is the broad definition by the United Nations Climate Change Framework. In simple terms, what this means is taking action to respond to current and future climate change impacts. So adaptation actions are actions that tend to increase resilience or our ability to benefit from climate consequences or to minimize negative impacts. So coming back to marine spatial planning, how does this relate to climate adaptation? So keep in mind that adaptation is about increasing resilience, increasing benefits, or minimizing consequences. So one of the things that marine spatial planning can do to support resilience, in this case, ecological resilience, is to allocate areas for the protection of key species and habitats. And these include species and habitats like seagrass meadows or kelp forests, which are also blue carbon ecosystems, and then we'll also act on the mitigation side, but we will go to that. So we can support nature-based solutions through the proper allocation of space. Another thing is to identify and allocate areas for the protection of climate refugia. So climate refugia are areas where the physical conditions are more stable or changing slowly in relation to climate change, and they can be used as a refugia for a species. Another pathway is to decrease other pressures from human stressors that are not related to climate change, like pressures from fishing or marine pollution. And MSP can contribute to this by limiting some uses in certain areas or even excluding them. Also, by providing a holistic and integrated vision about the management of a particular area. And this is key to support climate adaptation actions. We need to have this integrated view because some actions that can be adaptive for one sector can be maladaptive to other. And so the integrated vision is very important. But marine spatial planning can also contribute to social resilience. How? By empowering human populations. How? By raising their awareness on climate impacts, by supporting ocean literacy, climate literacy, and capacity building, and by involving stakeholders, local communities, decision makers on the co-design of solutions, and sometimes on finding alternative jobs, alternative livelihoods for people, for example, that work on uses that will be affected by climate change. In a spatial perspective, marine spatial planning can also anticipate conflicts that will come from all those climate-related changes and reduce them in advance, try to solve them in advance. And we can define areas to be used or not in advance, for example, like using the anticipatory zoning approach. MSP can also contribute to mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions themselves, but this usually takes a more national level scale when we are talking about allocating areas for the expansion of marine renewable energy. And a couple of years ago, there was this roadmap by the United Nations Global Compact on how to support offshore renewables with marine spatial planning. But there are also actions that contribute to mitigation that are more local, which are supporting blue carbon capture and storage, for example, by blue carbon ecosystems protection. And this is a synergy with climate adaptation. So These are shortly the three pathways that we can use. As I mentioned, we don't need to have the three of them. Ideally, we would. They are interlinked, they work together, but depending on context, we will have a different combination of the three pathways and the related actions. So the next steps to really develop climate smart MSP is to take all these considerations to the case study level, because it is at the local level, at the national level, that we will have the selection of the best approaches, the one that fits the context that is in place, and is where we will make actually the decisions. So thank you so much for your time and attention. And if you want to get a bit more information on details about the climate change and marine spatial planning nexus, we have this paper that we published a couple of years ago, and I'm happy to share it with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Catarina. That was very inspiring, very relevant, and really introducing to the next talks. And the next one will be my talk. Briefly present myself. I'm a research manager at the National Research Council Marine Science Institute, based in Venice. And in the last 15 years, 20 years, I've been working on coastal and marine policy and studies supporting their design and their implementation. And I'm currently working consistently on maritime spatial planning, both from an EU Mediterranean perspective and the national level. And in this second case, I'm a member of a scientific team of experts made by CNR, Corilla, and the University of Architecture here in Venice, that is contributing, supporting the national competent authority in Italy in delivering the MSP plans. And that's the experience I'd like to share with you, with some consideration about what those plans are doing to integrate at least partially climate change into maritime spatial planning. I hope you can see my presentation, and I'll go through it very quickly. So before entering into the specific issue of the talks today, I need to briefly tell you something more about the Italian MSP plans, which are plans. There are 3 plans we are developing. As you can see here, they pertain to 3 marine areas: the Mediterranean, Western Mediterranean maritime area, the Ionian Central Mediterranean maritime area, and the Adriatic maritime area, which is the one I will consider for my presentation today for obvious reasons. We started working on the plans years ago, I would say at least a couple of years ago. And in September last year, we delivered a draft version of the plans that enter into the phase of public consultation and strategic environmental assessment, which is still, which partially ended in terms of public consultation of the plan by end of last year, while the strategic environmental assessment is still progressing. In the meanwhile, we are working on the plan's revision with the aim of advancing and towards the final version of the plan, let's say by the next few months. The plans as to are quite articulated. For the talk today, I would mention that they have 2 major components. There is a strategic component which provide a vision about the sea, the ocean space we would like to achieve through the plan's implementation. And this vision is traduced and is translated into strategic objectives, which have been set looking at the targets defined by international, European Union, and national legislation and policy to a number of sectors, to a number of topics, and you can see some of them mentioned here in the slide. Linked to these strategic objectives, there are also several specific objectives which have been defined at the regional, local level, which do provide the detailed specification of the objectives set for the 3 plans at the level of regional and local scales. And I'll come back to this very shortly. What is important to say is that the plans include quite an ambitious and rich package of measures, which are identified to make to implement the objectives, both the strategic and specific ones, and to implement the zoning provisions of the plans, which I will talk about in the next slide. So that's the second component of the plan. We could consider this the zoning core of the Italian MSP plans. Each of the 3 maritime areas has been subdivided in in sub-areas, which in the case of the Adriatic are 9. The Adriatic includes 6 sub-areas which do extend from the coastline to the delimitation of the 12 nautical miles, so to the delimitation of the territorial sea, and 3 offshore sub-areas which extend beyond the 12 nautical miles to the delimitation of the continental shelf as agreed with the neighboring states. And each of these sub-areas is itself subdivided in planning units, so through a sort of multi-scalar approach to maritime spatial planning. And the planning units are the core spatial essence of the plan, as we do define at this level priority uses in each of the planning unit and provide elements to be taken into consideration when we want to manage conflicts among the uses within the planning units, and very importantly, between the uses and the needs for the protection of the environment and the preservation of the cultural heritage assets which are present in each of the planning units. So, but coming to the focus of our talk today. So how much is the Italian plan, how much are the Italian MSP plans climate change proofed, a climate smart plan? It's hard to say. As Catarina pointed out, this is quite a novel issue, not only for Italy, but for a number of countries around the world. We could say that in the case of Italy, this is definitely the situation. And that's the integration of climate change into MSP is definitely an evolving process. Why? We are still working on improving this in the current version of the plan. And for example, we are trying to better integrate the provision of the national climate change adaptation plan, which is itself undergoing the strategic environmental assessment phase, into the MSP plan. But also we shall consider that what we're going to produce will be a first step of an evolving process. It is always said, it's often said that the plan itself does not provide the final result of an MSP planning process, which continues beyond the plan delivering an approval, of course, through its implementation, but even quite importantly, is also its monitoring, revision, and adaptation, which will mean adaptation also to the new and evolving evolution of knowledge about climate change and pressure about climate change, we shall consider in the next revision of the plan. Of course, the Italian plans do include all the linkages at the strategic level between the plan itself and the policy and documents which deal with climate change adaptation at the international, European, national level. I'm not talking today very much about this in my presentation because I'd like to focus a little bit more on some operational aspect about how the plan to integrate climate change related topics into the plan, and in particular on those topics which do have some relevance for the subnational level, so for the coastal regions and even in some cases for the local municipalities in Italy. And here you can see the 4 topics that we are considering, and there are ICZM and coastal defense, environmental protection, environmental restoration, and low carbon. And Catarina already said very well how that these elements are important to improve climate change adaptation into maritime spatial planning. So concerning the first element, the first topic about coastal protection, we all know that the Adriatic coastlines of Italy are highly vulnerable to erosion and flooding. This is particularly relevant for the northern and central Adriatic, and is going to be exacerbated by the intensification of extreme events due to climate change. So the plan at the strategic level, through a specific measure, call for an update and integration of all the existing instruments. There are quite many instruments at the regional, national level approaching this topic in Italy. There is definitely a need to make them more updated and to make them integrated in a unique frame. So here we are referring to the coastal adaptation plan set by the regional authorities, to the flood risk management plan developed according to the flood directive, and to the ICZM strategy and plans against set at the national and regional level. The plan also deals with a specific topic. We know that one of the measures which is implemented to deal with coastal erosion is beach nourishment, and in some cases also dune reconstruction. To do this, we need sand, and part of the sand is definitely taken from the sea. So there is an important need to know where the sand deposits of the sea are, and to preserve this use and avoid conflicts with other users. So the Italian MSP plan, and specifically the Adriatic MSP plan in Italy, identified planning units where the priorities is exactly on the said instructions, and you can see here this planning unit colored in yellow in the map in the figure, supporting this zoning exercise with a number of dedicated measures to the topic, which deal with extension and improvement of mapping of offshore sand deposit, priority planning of this resource, which itself is a limited resource, so we need to prioritize its use in a proper way, and guidelines to reduce conflicts with other uses, principally aquaculture, fishery, but also nature protection, and testing new nature-based solutions on the coast to improve coastal resilience. Moving to the second topic, which is quite a large topic, Catarina stressed the importance of allocating proper space to natural protection of key species and habitats to improve the resilience of these species and habitats to cumulative pressures, to a number of human pressures, including climate change. And this is what the plan is actually doing, responding to the targets set by the EU strategy on biodiversity, which foresee by 2030 the protection of the 30% of the sea and 1/3 of this 30% of strictly protection. So the plan provides the framework to identify through the proper process to respond through pledges to this EU strategy to the target set at the EU level. So what the plan does, it identifies a number of planning units where the priority is on nature protection, and those are the planning units you can see here marked, colored in light green, or colored with other colors when these priorities combined with other priorities. And those are the areas where marine protected areas are located, where also that includes also Natura 2000 site at sea, or that also might include other spatially based measures which provide direct or indirect protection of the environment. Here, for example, we do refer to the fishery restricted areas, which are set for fish restocking reasons, but they do also provide a very relevant and important benefit for environmental protection. Not only for all the other units which are not prioritized for natural protection, the plan identify, recommend to take into proper consideration all the environmental aspects which are included in the planning unit to limit, of course, the impacts and support as much as possible the protection and conservation of these environmental elements within the planning unit. This is again supported by a number of measures. The first one actually do refer specifically to this objective of supporting through the Maritime Spatial Plan the extension of marine protected area, and deals with establishment of a working group at the national and regional level that put together those who are working on the implementation of the Marine Spatial Planning Directive and those who are working on the implementation of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and particularly concerning the biodiversity aspect, which means try to work together to identify new MPAs, new Natura 2000 sites, and new areas that can respond to the criteria set for the identification of other effective spatial conservation measures that are the measures I was mentioning before, set to regulate the uses which can provide direct or indirect benefits for the environment. Coming to the last two topics I would like to address in my talk, the plan also look at restoration as an important issue, also in consideration of the approaching upcoming EU law on the restoration of the environment, and considering restoration of degraded marine habitats as a way, again, to improve the resilience of species and habitats. Here we are referring to a wide variety of marine habitats, of course, seagrasses, but also salt marshes, which pertain to more transition environment between land and sea, the rocky outcrops in the North Adriatic, and the more deep habitats in the South Adriatic. And part of this is also the focus on blue carbon ecosystems, which are ecosystems that have to be preserved and protected, but that can also be restored when needed. We, for the plan, like to support and the implementation of a study on the proper understanding of the contribution of blue carbon ecosystem to climate change mitigation and to other co-benefits, to understand how much they really can contribute to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere and provide so a real contribution to carbon sequestration. As I said, this is an ongoing exercise, and we are currently working, as I think I said this before, in a better alignment of the Maritime Spatial Plans with the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan, which is undergoing a strategic environmental assessment. We are also introducing one of the concepts Catarina was referring to, that of climate refuge within the MSP plans. For the moment, still at the level of assessment and analysis, preparing the ground for the next cycle of the MSP planning effort for a real integration of this concept also in a planning perspective. I would like also to stress that the plan itself recognizes that this is a first step towards a climate change integration, climate proofing of MSP in Italy, and include a specific measure which aims at providing a more detailed study on the impact of climate change of MSP plans and on sectors and the environmental component the plans deals with, to be taken into consideration in the implementation of the plan and the full package of measures. Just to conclude, I would like to mention that to deal with this quite ambitious exercise of improving the nexus between climate change and MSP, we need knowledge, and we also need tools. And there are a wider range of tools which are available and which have been also mentioned by the previous speaker. And I will refer to other experience you can see here in the slide. As a research group in the National Research Council, we are working, for example, on since several years on the development application of a tool for cumulative effect assessment, and now we are dealing with the improvement of the integration of the climate change component in this tool. Another tool which I find really useful and which has a more framing strategic perspective is the one developed by friends of PAPRAC, which is part of the MSP workspace hosted by the AZZM platform managed by PAPRAC, which do provide some framing questions on the way climate change can be and shall be integrated into MSPs, from the analysis of the impacts to the identification of possible adaptation measures that can be implemented for the MSP plan. Last but not least, I'd like to mention a project we started in November last year, funded by the MFAF program of the European Commission, which is called MSP Green, which is going to dig into the assessment about how the MSP plan can or shall implement the Green Deal objectives. So that here the scope is definitely wider, but climate change is perfectly included in this project, both in terms of climate change adaptation mitigation, and we'd like to come to some recommendations, but to strengthen the linkages between MSP and Green Deal in the next couple of years. I thank you very much for your attention, and here are my contacts in case you need to pose me any questions and any kind of interactions. And thank you very much for your attention. Okay, it's me again. Sorry, I interrupt the sharing, and I'll let my colleague and good friend Vesna to present the Croatian experience. Vesna has been working for several years on coastal planning and maritime spatial planning, very much involved in the national process. She is an architect and planner, and she worked for many years on the Croatian Planning Institute. And I'm very glad, Vesna, you are here to provide your perspective from the other side of the Adriatic.
Well, thank you, Emiliano, for the introduction. I have nothing to add. You said everything important about me and my involvement in MSP. So now, shall I share my screen, or you will put the presentation I sent to you? Or I can. Okay.
You shall share your screen, please.
Okay. Okay. Now you can see.
Yes, if you can put in presentation mode.
Just let me put. Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So I would like to say something about the experience of adaptation and mitigation to climate change in MSP in Croatia. And first of all, the present status is that we have no particular directions in the field of spatial planning, including MSP, because I think that most of you know that spatial plans in Croatia comprise terrestrial and maritime part as well. So MSP is a part of the general spatial planning process. If we talk about the legal frame in which the climate changes are somehow handled, this is regulated by this overall frame, which is somehow scattered and fragmented between the sectors. If we talk about spatial planning, spatial development strategy provides general directions for climate change's mitigation and adaptation within the physical planning system, but it doesn't give the specific measures, or it doesn't give specific directions how to implement it in spatial plans.
Vesna,
Sorry.
May I interrupt you for a second? Your presentation is not very well visible. It is too big for the screen, or it's not adapted to the screen. I don't know how to remediate that, but we actually cannot read the whole text. No, it's only part. We can only see a part of your presentation. Either Agnese, could you try to use the one Vesna has anticipated so that we have a visible version?
Yeah.
Because there's actually part of the presentation cut off.
Maybe this would be better.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah. Although it's not the presentation mode, but at least we can read everything. Thank you.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. So
Thank
this,
you. Sorry for the interruption.
No, okay, so this would be okay. Can you see it now better? Can you see it better?
Yes. Now we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, so as I mentioned, there are no specific or particular directions in the field of spatial planning, so in the field of MSP as well. We somehow help ourselves, or we implement these climate change issues through the strategic environmental assessment. So this is for now the main instrument how to implement or how to handle these climate change issues in spatial planning. So climate change effects are analyzed, and the measures for mitigation or adaptation are given related to the individual and cumulative impact of the plan. But I would have to point out that the results of analysis and the measures are transposed to the spatial plan unsystematically, and they are primarily focused on the coastal area. And as for transboundary cooperation, it is done only in the case it is estimated. So when it is estimated through the SEA procedure that transboundary cooperation is necessary, then it takes place or it is carried out. But if not, this transboundary cooperation is somehow neglected or left to the other spatial planning authorities, whether they will or carry it out, or they will somehow choose the way how to carry this transboundary cooperation. And as the general issue, I would also like to point out that there is a lack of data and long-term monitoring in the EEZ area, which has been declared 1.5 years ago. So what sectors are involved? As I mentioned, this whole procedure is somehow scattered and fragmented between the sectors, but I would like to say that there are three sectors that are somehow main in this procedure. The first sector is one which is dealing with climate activities, and another one that has the authority over the nature protection and environmental protection. All these sectors I mentioned are within the Ministry of Economy and Sustainable Development. So this is somehow the core part. Then it comes to other sectors which are in charge of all the activities that take place in the marine area and in the terrestrial part as well, of course. And then we have the Ministry of Physical Planning, Construction and State Assets, which is in charge of spatial planning. And this sector, or better to say, spatial planning, is somehow an integrative part for all of them. So this is the point of meeting of all the sectors, their requirements, their inputs, and their determined measures. And what is also important to mention, that there is the field of risk management, which covers all the sectors, and it is also a very important part of the MSP and all other activities. So the legal frame I mentioned is or has to be respected. It defines the horizontal and the vertical cooperation between all the sectors and between the whole regulative part. The first step is to somehow fulfill the requirements from the international UN and EU part of this legal frame. We all know the main parts of this international level, which is the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, then UN level, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, then this protocol on integrated coastal zone management in the Mediterranean. These are how somehow the most important parts of international and transnational level. Then on EU level, we have the EU strategy on adaptation to climate change and European Green Deal as somehow the most important legal frame to which our legal frame refers to. So when we come to the basic national legal frame related to climate change, we have also these three important parts I have mentioned at the beginning. So the one dealing with climate activities, this is Act on Climate Change and Protection of the Ozone Layer. Then nature and environment protection. These are the environmental, the Nature Protection Acts, and the Act on protection of conservation of cultural property. Well, this is not somehow directly referred to nature or environment protection, but it is a very important part of landscape protection. And then we come to spatial planning, where the basic act is Physical Planning Act. And also other regulations of individual sectors all refer to climate changes, but maybe these three fields I pointed out at the beginning are the most important in our legal frame for dealing with climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. The Act on Climate Change stresses out that provisions of the Environmental Protection Act are applied for mitigation and adaptation to climate changes. This is somehow also the relation with the SEA, or Strategic Environmental Assessment, which I mentioned at the beginning. So essential measures to mitigate and adapt to climate change and protect the ozone layer refer to strengthening resistance, reducing the vulnerability, increasing the ability to recover, and trying to avoid, prevent, or reduce consequences on human health, quality of life, and environment, and also the prevention and reduction of pollution affecting the ozone layer and climate change. And in these mitigating mitigating measures, encouraging the use of renewable res, let's say. What are the basic documents on climate change and protection of the ozone layer? This is as the first document, Strategy on Adaptation to Climate Change. So this strategy somehow gives the strategic and all the inputs, in fact, and it says that all strategic and development documents of all sectors and at all levels should be in line with the principles, basic goals, priorities, and measures established in the climate change adaptation strategy and the low carbon development strategy. So it somehow says that give the basic input to all the sectors. Then when planning their strategic documents and their activities, they have to rely on these documents referring to climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. So this also the integrated energy and climate plan deals with climate change mitigation in the sense of decreasing the carbon gas emissions. And also the Act on Climate Change and Ozone Layer says that adaptation to climate change is going to be by implementing adaptation measures in vulnerable sectors. So this strategy on adaptation to climate changes has its basic components, and but it gives the initial assessment, data, and inputs for climate change mitigation and adaptation for all the sectors, including MSP. So when we will come later to MSP and what we have to fulfill within this process, it is important to say that the basic inputs and the basic assessments are given in this strategy on adaptation to climate change. So when we come to nature and environmental protection, the basic acts are, as I already mentioned, the Environmental Protection Act and Nature Protection Act. Environmental Protection Act gives the basic input that SEA is mandatory for spatial plans. So this is also one argument why to use SEA as the main tool in spatial planning, including MSP. This strategic environmental assessment gives somehow or deals with the assessment of possible significant impacts on the environmental which may occur due to the implementation of the plan and of course also of the strategy or program, meaning that in all sectors this SEA is also mandatory when making their strategic documents. Nature Protection Act does not directly say something special about climate change, but giving the measures for nature protected areas also through the strategic environmental assessment, it somehow indirectly deals with climate change issues. So the basic documents within the legal frame of nature and environmental protection are a sustainable development strategy, which is followed by the program and the plan, and the strategy for the management of the marine environment and coastal area, which is now in the process of development, but the program of measures for the management of the marine environment and coastal area is already or has been already adapted, and it gives some specific measures to all the sectors how to manage the marine environment and coastal area. What is the importance of this strategy for management of the marine environment and the coastal area? It gives initial assessment for protecting the marine environment and the coastal area. It also gives the environmental protection goals. It somehow gives the initial status of this marine environment, which is to be conservated and protected. It gives the indicators to be followed or through which this good status is monitored, and through which we can see whether we fulfilled these our goals with sustainable development, or if we didn't fulfill them. It also gives the economic and social analysis of the use and deterioration of the marine and coastal area. And as I mentioned before, this program of measures gives the measures to all the sectors, how they would manage all their activities in order to preserve marine and coastal area. Nature protection strategy and action plan, and strategy and action plan for the protection of biological and landscape diversity are important in this context of climate change, in a sense that they give the inputs how to preserve biodiversity. So in spatial planning, there are no specific orders in the Physical Planning Act. Only in one article it is said that long-term changes caused by climate change should be taken into account when planning the coastal and marine area. This is the only place where the climate change in this backbone act is actually stated. But in basic documents of spatial planning in the physical planning system, climate changes are mentioned, especially in spatial development strategy, which is available online in English language. So therefore I put this link here, especially in the main chapter, Resilience to Change. In this chapter, in fact, there are some inputs and guidelines when considering spatial development, how to preserve this or how to achieve this resilience to some specific changes. One of them is climate change, including adaptation and mitigation, then strengthening natural capital by planning the development of green infrastructure, which also has a connection to climate change adaptation and mitigation. Then increasing energy efficiency, which also has the imply on mitigating the climate changes. And sustainable waste management, also not a direct but indirect connection to climate change. And also sustainable management of mineral raw materials, which also has the indirect connection to climate change through the energy consumption and through the sources of energy, whether they are renewable or not renewable, and so on. Then physical planning program, which is in force until the state spatial development plan is adopted. It also has chapters dealing with climate change. And as the most important part, these are the spatial plans on national, regional, and local levels, which are integrative, developed for land and the marine area. And these are somehow the main instruments for implementing spatial planning, and also in terms of MSP, because as I said, we have this integrative approach to land and marine area planning. So what are the main impacts and challenges in the Croatian part of the Adriatic Sea? They are somehow recognized in strategic documents and primarily in the strategy on adaptation to climate change. And so the sea level rise in sea temperature, acidity increase, and as the result, extreme weather conditions are recognized as the main issues, and the need for working or for dealing with these issues is stressed in all other documents dealing with climate change. So sea level rise has a direct impact on the coastal area in flooding, erosion, endangerment of cultural heritage, soil salinization, threat to drinking water reserves, etc. And so mainly the impact on the coastal part, and as for MSP, it would be in LSI, so in land-sea interactions area. A rise in sea temperature is maybe the most important one, because it causes the changes in thermohaline properties. So it has the impact on sea currents, it endangers biodiversity, and it maybe has the most important influence on some economy activities in the marine area. Acidity increase.
Vesna, sorry to interrupt you. If you could come to the conclusions in a couple of minutes.
Okay, I have only one, I think one more slide.
Thank you.
So main sectors under pressure are in the field of fisheries, aquaculture, and biodiversity, but also all other sectors, transport, infrastructure, energy, and tourism and recreation are under attack. And also, when we were talking about the possibility of nature protected areas to be somehow an important factor for climate change mitigation and adaptation, I would like to say that there are no protected areas in EEZ, so we shall have to work on this part of protection. And so for the conclusion, what would be the further steps? So strengthening protection of marine protected areas, particularly in EEZ, enhancing knowledge and monitoring in the field of climate changes, setting indicators for evaluation, development of systematic approach to climate change effects in the field of spatial planning, improving the interaction between SEA and spatial planning, active involvement of maritime sectors in MSP, building an efficient model of horizontal cooperation between sectors. Perhaps we are trying to establish permanent cross-sectoral working group, improving interaction between ICZM and MSP, and establishing a model of transboundary cooperation within the EU and at regional and global levels. So we have a lot of things to do, and there is a great challenge in front of us, and MSP as the integrated element in further building of climate change adaptation framework. So that would be all.
Thank you. Thank you, Vesna, and apologies for having you made rushing. There are a lot of questions, and we have only some minutes because we were supposed to talk for 1 hour, and now we are almost approaching 1 hour and a half. Our interpreters must be very tired, so I will try to be very short and reassume only very few questions. Apologies to those who don't see their questions answered. They could eventually also use the email addresses published to address directly our speakers. So one question on one complex of, so one question I had was already answered. The collaboration between Croatia and Italy on what is in the middle of the sea and how this area is being planned, I think is not yet really entered into the MSP, but is still on the to-dos list, as Vesna just showed it. Another very different complex of questions addresses the difficulties of interaction with local stakeholders. This was risen when Catarina talked, but then popped up also when Emiliano talked. What are difficulties? Which difficulties do you face? How is this being done to talk with local stakeholders? As was said in Catarina's presentation, adaptation is actually taking place at the end at the local level and has very local implications. So if both Emiliano and Catarina, and perhaps also Vesna, can explain us briefly how this is addressed and what the difficulties are.
I can just share at the global level first.
Yes.
And Vesna go to the details, but participation in marine spatial planning is a challenge in itself. It's an entire challenge. And it's not just about marine spatial planning. I think all public processes have these challenges about how to identify the right stakeholders, the people that are affected by the plans or that have interest on the plans, and then how to move them to the process, how to show them the relevance of participating. And in many countries, and in Portugal, we have this problem, is sometimes people tend not to be involved because they think either that their opinion is not important or that the process will not take it into account. So there's a lot of work to do there, but it's fundamental that the right stakeholders are involved, because otherwise the plans then will not be complied with the same way, and solutions will not reflect the needs and the knowledge of the people that are affected by the plans.
Thank you. Emiliano?
I can only add that it needs time, it needs resources, must be planned and organized in advance, and it is a big issue. I mean, if we refer to the Italian experience, we can say that we had a partial involvement of stakeholders, some of the stakeholders. It can definitely be improved, it shall be improved. And that's why, for example, one of the measures which are included in the Italian MSP plans goes exactly in this direction, to establish a permanent mechanism to make the plan even more and always more and more looking at and being open to the input from the stakeholders and from the local communities. As I said, that this is a first step, as in the case of the other MSP processes around the world. With the plan, the process doesn't stop just we could say that it begins indeed in terms of implementation, in terms of monitoring, adaptation, and revision. And that is where we need even more the input from the local communities and stakeholders in general.
So when it comes to Croatia, we have stakeholders defined in the mentioned Physical Planning Act. But when it comes to implementation, then the issues appear, of course. But the stakeholders are somehow determined. And the public hearing and the way how to put the requests and so on, this is everything under control within the legal frame.
Okay, thank you, Vesna. Yeah, there was. I think we should close now. Please prepare your cell phones because one related project or several related projects have already been named. There will be one other project to be presented, which is where partners of our CREATE cluster are working. Keep your cell phones ready because you will see a QR code so you can quickly scan and access the information in a second moment. Please, Ivan, share your screen.
Hello, I hope that you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
I'm Ivan from Paprak. We are partner of CREATE project, and since this is a MSP themed webinar, I just wanted to briefly draw your attention to our ongoing project called MSP for Bio. This is a Horizon funded project with 6 test sites in 5 European basins, 17 partners. So it's a big project, but the main aim is protection and restoration of marine ecosystems. So it's a MSP project, but more based on the protection and restoration. And of course, it includes climate change mitigation and adaptation. So I invite you to visit the webpage msp4bio.eu or to scan this QR code, which can lead you to our newsletter. And also, as Emiliano was explaining, we have the MSP workspace, which is coordinated by Paprak, and the link is in the Q&A, which was posted by my colleague, Marina. That's all. I don't want to hijack the CREATE webinar, so thank you very much.
No, thank you. This is an interesting additional resource also to where to pose questions which we could not answer today. For all those who are asking for the slides, we do not publish the slides. And please refer to our YouTube channel. Here is the address once more. Oops, can't get into the presentation mode. Or refer to so YouTube CREATE Climate Responses is our YouTube channel where you can find in some days' time the registration of this webinar. Go through, stop where you find it more interesting, stop to scan Ivan's QR code if you do not find place on the website of the Paprak in Split. So I would thank all of you for this very, very interesting presentation. We had a lot of participants. We had 200 participants in this webinar, and a lot of questions we could not answer. As I said, please keep on following us and join us the next time on the 13th of 5th of April. Am I right? No, 5th of March for our next webinar. Thank you, everybody, and see you soon again. Goodbye.